All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It is now 4:07, and in the interest of time, and for those who have joined us already, I will go ahead and formally start the meeting. Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this June meeting of the ERC, or Emission Reduction Credit Public Advisory Work Group. My name is Errol Villegas. I am a permit services manager here in the Fresno office. To my left, I have Brian Clerico, who is a supervising air quality engineer. And then to his left, I have Jesse Garcia, one of our senior air quality engineers. And then to my right, I have my director, Brian Clements, the director of permit services. Before we officially begin, I want to go over some housekeeping instructions. Again, for those in attendance, please silence other communication devices, such as your mobile phone, cell phone, or desk phone. This will ensure that we are not having any feedback that can interrupt the meeting. I also want to mention that only public advisory work group members and district staff will be visible on this Zoom meeting. For those PAW members, please make sure that you are muted on Zoom unless you're wishing to make a comment or ask a question. Throughout the meeting, we will open up various points during the presentation to answer comments and questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we will also formally have a comment and question period. Again, as with the last meeting, for any of the public advisory work group members, please feel free to ask any comments or questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to answer those questions appropriately at that time. For members of the public participating via Zoom, please raise your hand or use the raise hand function so you may be recognized, and then we will call your name during these comment periods. For those participating via teleconference, please press *9 to raise your hand and be recognized to speak. Our staff will call out your last 4 digits of your phone number when it's your turn to speak, and then you can press *6 to unmute yourself. And then lastly, there will be an ability to submit comments or questions via email using the email address of webcast@valleyair.org. That will be also on the presentation once we put that forward. And then we will answer those questions through the email submittal process also. With that, I will pass on. Can we pull up the presentation, please? I will pass on the microphone to Jesse Garcia, who will start the presentation process.
All right, thank you, Errol. Once again, I'm Jesse Garcia, Senior Air Quality Engineer in the Permit Services Department, and today we'll be presenting the amendments under consideration for Rule 2201 and Rule 2301. I'll be providing the first portion of today's presentation, and then we'll be handing over to Brian Clerico to present on Rule 2301. So in today's presentation, we'll be covering the principal amendments being proposed for Rules 2201 and 2301. The 2201 amendments to be addressed are federal offset equivalency demonstration, offsetting requirements, and then other potential amendments. And then also for the 2301 amendments that Brian will cover, those will be application timeliness, definition of shutdown, and then also other potential amendments there. So as you guys know, there's been quite a lot of work with CARB and EPA and this PAW. And you're just going through the nuances of the district's offset program. And just to sort of recap there, the district is no longer equivalent with the federal offset program for NOx and VOC, but remains equivalent for the other pollutants. And since the district is unable to demonstrate equivalency for NOx and VOC, the current NSR rule contains a remedy to amend the rule to ensure that federal offsetting requirements can be met on an ongoing basis. And the information on the next few slides will cover the district's proposed amendments to fulfill the requirements of the remedy and additional amendments to 2201. So with that, we'll go ahead and begin our proposed amendments for Rule 2201. So for NOx and VOC, they will be removed from the system, the tracking system going forward, because federal NSR offsetting requirements will be applied to new major sources and federal major modifications, and that's for NOx and VOC. For PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO, those will remain in the tracking system, and the valuation of equivalency will be based on one comprehensive test for each of these pollutants. This test will require that for all ETC projects issued during the tracking year, the district must be able to match the total federal offset quantity required for that pollutant with an equal amount of surplus emission reductions valued at time of use. And this would be a version of what was previously called Test 2, or the surplus value test in Rule 2201, Section 7.2.2. And this is the appropriate measure for programmatic equivalency. And then the remedy for failure is implementation of the federal NSR offset system. The current two-test approach and associated separate remedies are not sufficient to ensure the district will remain equivalent with federal offsetting requirements when one test fails. And so using one test for equivalency ensures federal offset equivalency, reduces complexity, and eliminates potential interpretive confusion of having different remedies for different tests. So moving forward, the district is proposing to use a multi-path approach for offsetting requirements, with a path for NOx and VOC, and then a separate path for PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO requirements. The path for NOx and VOC emissions would be to integrate the federal offsetting program into 2201, which is consistent with the current requirements and equivalency remedies in place. For new major sources and federal major modifications, we would require the federal offset quantity, or FOQ. This would be because since reclassification to extreme non-attainment for ozone, programmatically the FOQ is at least as stringent as the district offset quantity, or the DOQ. And then we'd also require the FOQ, the federal offset quantity, to be satisfied with ERCs that are surplus at time of use. And then for all other projects, we'd require the district offset quantity, the DOQ, and the DOQ may be satisfied with any valid ERC. And this is consistent with state law and historic California Air District practice. And lastly, for this path, the district would no longer need to track projects that require NOx and VOC offsets for the offset equivalency system. And then for the other part of the multi-path approach, applicable to PM10, PM2.5, and SOx and CO, is a little more straightforward in that it follows the district's current offsetting procedures for the most part. For all ATC projects, the district would require the DOQ, and the DOQ may be satisfied with any valid ERC. And once again, this is consistent with state law and historic California Air District practice. This path for these pollutants is still appropriate because Rule 2201 offsetting requirements are more stringent than federal NSR. As such, the district will continue to track and include these pollutants in federal offset equivalency system to ensure that our requirements are at least as stringent as the federal program. And therefore, the offsetting requirements for these pollutants are not expected to change. And now we'll discuss some other potential amendments to the district NSR rule. The district is considering amendments to clarify which provisions may be utilized for NOx and VOC, new major sources and federal major modifications are consistent with federal offsetting requirements, which include exploring the amendment of the baseline emissions definition to clarify when historic actual emissions must be used rather than pre-project potential to emit, like potentially removing the clean emissions unit provision, explore retaining a modified fully offset emissions unit definition and provision, and explore retaining the highly utilized emission unit provision. Furthermore, we'll explore the emission offset exemptions, including but not limited to the exemption for emergency equipment. And additionally, the district is considering specifying provisions for calculating the unbanked shutdown emission reductions from a facility. In other words, require that the emission reductions be actual emission reductions. And then we'll explore the Clean Air Act Section 182E2 offset provisions for extreme areas to allow the use of internal offsets at 1.3 to 1. And so with that, that concludes the 2201 section, and then we'll go ahead and pass it back to Errol.
Thanks, Jesse. So at this time, I'll go ahead and open it up for any comments or questions regarding the proposed potential amendments to the district's NSR rule or Rule 2201. Do we have any comments or questions from the members of the Public Advisory Work Group?
Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, Jesse, Roger Isom, California Congeners, Western Ag Processors. On that last part about the unbanked credits, wouldn't they always be actual, or I'm failing to understand how that's a change?
You want the presentation up?
Yeah, so historically for these types of, I think these were what we'd consider previously the orphan shutdowns.
Right.
And we were not, I think previously they were not meeting the entire definition of an actual emission reduction. And so just to strengthen those credits, we want to ensure that they were able to meet that definition now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no other comments from the members of the Public Advisory Work Group. Do we have comments from, I guess, the members of the public or interested stakeholders?
First up is Pedro.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Pedro Hernandez. I'm the Deputy Director with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. I have a clarifying question so I can help understand some of these revisions. On one of the slides, you said that you'd be exploring the baseline emissions. And so does that mean that the Air District will be looking like retroactively at all of the emission banks? Or yeah, just I want some clarification on that if possible. And
so for the proposed amendments that would be included in Rule 2201, they would only apply moving forward. There is no intent to go back because the projects that were evaluated utilized the version of District Rule 2201 that would have been applicable at the time that they were evaluated. So this would be projects moving forward if and when our governing board adopts amendments to address the baseline emissions calculations. Okay. Next commenter. Okay, so no other comments. Okay, I don't see any comments on the webcast email at this point, so we'll go ahead and keep moving forward. If you do have any other comments or questions, again, please go ahead and raise your hand or indicate that you want to ask a question, and we will do our best to stop and answer those. But I'll pass it on to Brian Clerico to go ahead and discuss amendments to District Rule 2301.
Thank you, Errol. Yes, my name is Brian Clerico. I'm a supervising air quality engineer here in Permit Services. I'm going to go over some ideas. Let's see. Some ideas for proposed amendments to Rule 2301, emission reduction credit banking. Rule 2301 concerns eligibility, application procedures, registration, withdrawal, transfer, and use of ERCs. These are sort of collectively considered administrative requirements for ERC banking. And specifically what we're going to discuss today has to do with ERC application timeliness, and even more specifically, the relation of the definition of shutdown in the rule to ERC application timeliness. And then we'll touch on some other more general topics that may be subjects for amendment in 2301. So to be eligible to bank an emission reduction, an ERC application must be timely. So the CARB report flagged ERC application timeliness as an issue for ERCs generated specifically by facility shutdowns here. And District Policy APR 1805, which is titled Policy on the Interpretation of the Definition of Shutdown, had also flagged this as an issue internally here and proposed a solution which the district had put into practice since the formation of the district. So this was in a way sort of a known issue, although there's probably a different interpretation about what that issue was. ERC application timeliness in Rule 2201 says this. It says an emission reduction is eligible for banking if an application is submitted within 180 days of the emission reduction occurrence. And that's stated in a couple places, what an emission reduction occurrence. So a lot turns on, well, what is an emission reduction occurrence? And so what we hope to do with these amendments is clarify the rule language here. And what we think we can do is implement a longstanding practice that does this. So to understand the emission reduction, or when an emission reduction occurs, I think it helps to consider the permitting actions that relate to an emission reduction. So for permitted sources, an emission reduction can come about through either reducing emissions from an emissions unit, voluntarily adding controls not required by law or regulation or beyond law or regulation. And if something like that's done, it requires an implementation of an authority to construct permit. And on the day the authority to construct is implemented and the emission unit begins operating with these reduced emissions, these sort of extra emission reductions, that can be considered the date of the emission reduction occurrence. So the date of emission reduction is the date the ATC is implemented. So you have a kind of a coincidence there between the permitting action and the emission reduction date. With shutdown, it gets a little more complicated when you have so a Rule 2301 has a definition for shutdown, and trying to relate that to the occurrence of an emission reduction gets a little tricky in the rule. So if you'll bear with me here, I'll go through the rule definition, the current Rule 2301 definition of shutdown. I know it's a bit tedious, but I think it's important. to spell it out here in detail. And there are two parts to the definition. So the first part of the definition of shutdown in 3.14 says, shall mean either the earlier of the permanent cessation of emissions from an emitting unit or the surrender of that unit's operating permit. So earlier of last emissions, and the underline there is not in the rule, it's underlined here to kind of signal your attention. But it's the earlier of last emissions or surrender of a permit to operate. So one thing to consider about this immediately from the definition, it is kind of peculiar because that order is sort of already legally required under Rule 2010, our permits required definition. You can't operate without a permit to operate. So there's almost no situation in which your surrender of the permit is going to precede your last emissions, not legally at any rate. So it's kind of a peculiar thing to state it like that. It's almost not even necessary to the definition. There just seems to be no legal situation in which you'd have PTO surrender precede last emissions. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the second part of the definition, it goes on to say, if prior to the surrender of the operating permit, the APCO determines that the unit has been removed or fallen into an inoperable and unmaintained condition, such that startup would require an investment exceeding 50% of the current replacement cost, and the owner cannot demonstrate to the satisfaction of the APCO that the owner intended to operate again, then the APCO may cancel the permit and deem the source shut down as of the date of last emissions. So this second part of the definition is describing a situation in which a unit has stopped emitting, so last emissions have happened, but the unit still has an active PTO. And it's letting the district assign essentially the shutdown date as the last emissions, date of last emissions. But then when you think about that for a moment, this part of the definition is really logically unnecessary. If that's what if you compare it to the first part of the definition, it seems to, this part of the definition seems to imply that priority in the first part of the definition is really given to PTO surrender. That's the only way this part of the definition makes sense. So this kind of leads us, these sort of internal problems with this definition, I think, lead us into some potential opportunities for clarification here with this definition. Because as written, Section 314 and 314.1 and 2, the first part and the second part of the definition are difficult to reconcile. 314, the first part implies priority should be given to last emissions over PTO surrender. But the second part sort of implies that PTO surrender must have been given priority over last emissions. So it's kind of internally inconsistent. And then also the fact that I discussed there, that the 314 also implies surrender of PTO can legally occur before last emissions, but that would be a violation of Rule 2010, permits required. And so since permitted sources cannot legally operate without a permit, 314 as written doesn't allow for any situation where surrender of PTO is given priority over last emissions. But if this were the intention of that, why mention PTO surrender at all? So these are sort of logical problems with the rule. The others are some practical problems with, one is, as written, the definition could be read to create an incentive to operate and to omit merely to extend application eligibility. And then likewise, another practical issue is the definition could be read to effectively eliminate seasonal sources from banking emission reductions. So one idea we're considering as a potential solution is coming from our district policy APR 1805, policy on the interpretation of the definition of shutdown from 1992. It provides language that is coherent and has been used in practice since the formation of the district. And that would simply say the components of this, the language in the policy says that for unpermitted sources, the date of shutdown shall be the date of last emissions from the permitted unit, from the emissions unit. Sorry, it's not a permitted unit. For permitted sources, the date of shutdown shall be the date of the surrender of the operating permit, unless the district determines that the unit has been removed or fallen into a state of disrepair, and there's no evidence of an intention to operate again. So we feel this is the sort of most practical and really consistent with practice rule language to solve this definition of shutdown in the language and the ERC application timeliness issue the rule has. So that's the issue of shutdown. Some other ideas we have for amending the rule are just very broadly. I won't go into any depth on these here, but revise as needed the administrative mechanisms, definitions, and procedures for the banking and use of other credible emission reductions. So that's the unbanked shutdown emission reductions, the air quality improvement deduction, the mobile source credits. So we want to, clarify the methods of crediting those reductions and the use of those reductions. And then a second issue, a major issue, is evaluate the appropriateness of future banking of greenhouse gas ERCs. So this question concerns to what extent the district might continue to bank greenhouse gas emission reductions, or if this is a kind of reduction, kind of ERC that we don't, ERC banking that we don't want to sort of maintain a bank for any longer, or at least any new banking actions potentially. So with that, are there, I guess we'll pause for questions.
So yeah, as Brian had stated, let's see if there are any comments or questions from members of the Public Advisory Work Group to start. Okay, no comments or questions from the PAW members. Any comments or questions from members of the public? Okay, no comments or questions from there. I am looking at the webcast email and don't see any comments or questions received in the email inbox. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next steps as far as the presentation is concerned. Again, we are going through the rule amendment process for District Rules 2201 and 2301. The district held a public scoping meeting last month, no, 2 months ago now, excuse me, it's June. So on April 15th, we held a public scoping meeting. We do have a public workshop scheduled for June 29th to discuss in more details some sections of the rule amendments, and we're hoping to have language and, draft language available for discussion. We are also looking to publish the rule as one of the next steps, and then our ultimate goal is to take it to the governing board for a public hearing sometime in late 2022, so later this year or early next year, 2023. Again, we hope for a robust public participation through this rule development process. And we do look forward to any comments and suggestions for improving or including potential amendments to rules 2201 and 2301. So that concludes the presentation that we have this afternoon. I will go ahead and open it up again for public comments in regards to both rules, 2201 potential amendments or 2301 amendments, and we'll begin with the Public Advisory Work Group members. Still no comments from the Public Advisory Work Group members. And how about comments from the general public? Okay. And then just in case, for those who have any comments or questions associated and want to send it via email, the email address is webcast@valleyair.org. I still don't see any comments there, but if you do have comments and want to submit them, you can submit them to us. With that, we'll go ahead and end the Public Advisory Work Group meeting. We really do appreciate everyone's participation and attendance this afternoon. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to contact us outside the Public Advisory Work Group meetings or PAW meetings. The next meeting is scheduled for the first Thursday of July, which I believe is July 7th. Look forward to sending out more information as we get closer to that date. And once again, thank you, and we can go ahead and conclude the meeting. Have a great afternoon.